No! No!
Medieval torture devices that actually existed. Picture a dark stone chamber beneath a castle. A man lies strapped to a wooden frame, ropes lashed around his wrists and ankles. An interrogator turns a handle, the ropes tighten. The man's body is stretched, slowly, until his shoulders, hips, and knees are pulled apart, at the joints the tendons screaming, the bones straining toward the moment they'll pop from their sockets. And the interrogator can stop and start again, for as long as he likes. This was the rack, and unlike many of the devices you've seen in horror films and museum gift shops, this one was terrifyingly real. Here's the twist that almost no one knows. Many of the most famous medieval torture devices, the ones plastered across the internet, never actually existed in the Middle Ages at all. They were invented centuries later to sell a sensational, gory image of the past. So today we're separating fact from fiction, the real devices and the famous fakes. Let's uncover the dark truth. The rack, the real king of torture. Let's begin with the device that truly earned its terrible reputation. The rack. The rack was a long wooden frame, raised off the ground, with a roller at one or both ends. The victim was laid flat, and their wrists and ankles were bound to ropes attached to those rollers. As the interrogator cranked a handle, the rollers turned, winding in the ropes and stretching the body in opposite directions with relentless mechanical force. The genius of its cruelty was control. Pain could be applied gradually, dialed up notch by notch. At first came agonizing tension. Then the joints, shoulders, hips, elbows, knees were dragged toward dislocation. Push far enough, and the body's ligaments would tear and the joints would wrench apart with a sound witnesses never forgot. Many victims were left permanently crippled even if they survived. Here's a crucial fact for historical honesty. The rack was real and genuinely used, but its heyday in places like England wasn't quite the popular medieval image. At the Tower of London, torture was mainly employed during the 16th and 17th centuries, and only on a small fraction of prisoners, usually to extract confessions or the names of co-conspirators in cases of treason and religious plotting. The purpose was almost always information. Under the unbearable strain of the rack, the goal was to make a prisoner say anything, names, confess to crimes, reveal secrets. And that exposes the dark flaw at the heart of all torture. A person in that much agony will say whatever they think will make it stop, true or not. That's the rack, undeniably real. But the next device proves you don't need an elaborate machine to inflict unbearable pain. The strappado, torture by rope alone. Now let's look at a method so brutally simple it needed almost no equipment at all. The strappado. The setup was chillingly basic. The victim's hands were tied behind their back. A rope was then attached to those bound wrists, thrown over a beam or pulley, and used to hoist the person up into the air by the arms, bent backward behind them. Think for a moment about what that does to the human body. When you're lifted by your wrists bound behind your back, your entire body weight wrenches your shoulders upward and backward against their natural movement. The shoulders are forced toward dislocation almost immediately. The pain is instant and overwhelming, and the torturers found ways to make it worse. Sometimes they would suddenly let the victim drop, only to jerk the rope tight again before they hit the ground. That violent stop sent a catastrophic shock through the already strained joints, frequently tearing them apart entirely. Sometimes heavy weights were tied to the victim's feet to multiply the force. The strappado, also known by names like the corda, was widely used across Europe, including by inquisitorial and secular courts hunting for confessions. Its terrible appeal to interrogators was its simplicity. All it required was a rope and something to throw it over. No expensive machine, no special chamber. Just a beam and gravity turned into instruments of agony. It's a grim reminder that the most effective torture often wasn't elaborate at all. And the same was true of our next device, which targeted one of the most sensitive parts of the body. The thumbscrew. Small, simple, and excruciating. Here's a device that fits in the palm of your hand. yet caused pain out of all proportion to its size, the thumbscrew. The thumbscrew was a small vise, usually made of metal. The victim's thumbs and sometimes fingers were placed between two bars or plates. Then a screw was slowly tightened, crushing the digits with steadily increasing pressure. Some versions had studs or ridges on the inner surfaces to dig into the flesh and bone for extra cruelty. The body part it targeted was no accident. Your fingers and thumbs are packed with nerve endings, which is why even a stubbed finger or a slammed knuckle is so sharply painful. Now imagine that sensitive bone and tissue being slowly, deliberately crushed by a tightening screw, with the interrogator turning it a fraction more whenever you refuse to talk. It's worth being precise about the history here. The thumbscrew as we know it was primarily a device of the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries onward, rather than the High Middle Ages. It became a common tool for extracting confessions and information across Europe precisely because it was portable, simple to use, and horrifyingly effective. The thumbscrew reveals something important about the logic of torture. It wasn't always about grand spectacle or elaborate machinery. Often it was about applying maximum pain to a small controllable device, slowly enough that the victim had time to break. And from a device aimed at the hands, we move to one aimed at silencing a person entirely. The scold's bridle, a cage for the tongue. This next device is disturbing in a different way because it was aimed less at extracting truth and more at controlling and humiliating, and it fell mostly on women. The scold's bridle, also called the branx, was an iron framework that locked around a person's entire head, forming a cage of metal bars. Its cruelest feature was a flat iron plate or bit that projected into the mouth, pressing down on the tongue. Some versions had spikes or ridges on this plate, so that any attempt to speak or move the tongue caused pain. Who was forced to wear it? Overwhelmingly, it was used on women accused of being scolds. That is, women branded as nagging, gossiping, quarreling, or speaking out of turn. It was also used to punish those accused of blasphemy or slander. The very purpose was to silence a voice that society had decided was too loud. The humiliation was the heart of the punishment. A woman locked into this iron cage was often led through the streets or chained in a public place for everyone to see and mock. She couldn't speak, couldn't eat, couldn't defend herself. She could only stand there, muzzled like an animal, while the community jeered. There's real history embedded in our language here. Phrases like "hold your tongue" carry the echo of an age when a tongue could literally be caged in iron for daring to speak. The scold's bridle stands as a chilling symbol of how torture and punishment were often tools to enforce social control, especially over women. And now we arrive at the part of this story that may surprise you most, the famous devices that were never real at all. The Iron Maiden, the most famous fake of all. Brace yourself for a genuine shock, because one of the most iconic medieval torture devices in the world is, in fact, a complete fabrication. You've seen it 100 times, the Iron Maiden, a human-sized iron cabinet, often shaped like a woman or a coffin, lined on the inside with long spikes. According to legend, a victim was forced inside, the doors were slowly closed, and the spikes pierced their body, leaving them to bleed to death in the dark while impaled. It's a horrifying image. It's also almost certainly not real history. Historians have found no credible evidence that the Iron Maiden was actually used as a torture device in the Middle Ages. The famous examples that toured museums and exhibitions appear to have been constructed much later in the 18th and 19th centuries, likely by assembling and embellishing old pieces of metalwork to create a sensational attraction. The whole concept seems designed to feed a public hungry for lurid tales of a barbaric medieval past. The most famous specimen, the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was popularized in the 19th century and was later understood to be a fabrication, not a genuine medieval instrument. This matters because the Iron Maiden has done more than almost anything else to shape our gory mental picture of the Middle Ages. The truth is that medieval people, however brutal their justice could be, did not build elaborate spiked coffins to kill prisoners. That nightmare was largely invented by later generations looking back. And the Iron Maiden isn't the only celebrated device that crumples under scrutiny. The Pear of Anguish and the Judas Cradle. More myths exposed. Let's keep pulling the thread, because two more infamous devices belong in the same suspicious category. First, the Pear of Anguish. This is the metal, pear-shaped object you'll find in countless lists of medieval horrors. The story goes that it was inserted into a victim's mouth or other orifices, and then expanded by turning a screw, forcing the metal petals open to stretch and mutilate from the inside. It sounds unspeakably cruel. But the historical reality is shaky. The Pear of Anguish is best described as a device of disputed use, likely originating in the early modern period rather than the Middle Ages. There's little solid evidence it was actually used the gruesome way the legends claim. Some surviving examples may have been entirely different tools whose true purpose has been lost or sensationalized, then repackaged as torture instruments for shock value. Then there's the Judas Cradle, a tall pyramid-shaped seat that a victim was supposedly lowered onto, the point pressing into the body under their own weight. Like the Iron Maiden, it features in endless museum displays and online lists, yet it lacks credible documentation from the medieval period itself. It appears to be another later invention dressed up in medieval costume. So why do these fakes persist? Because they're memorable, theatrical, and they confirm a story we've been told for centuries, that the medieval world was a uniformly savage dark age. Sensational museums, lurid books, and the internet all help these myths spread far faster than the duller, more careful truth. Which brings us to the most important point of all. Why the myths spread and why the truth matters. Let's step back and ask the deeper question. Why is it so hard to separate real medieval torture from invented horror? Part of the answer is commercial. From the 18th and 19th centuries onward, there was real money and fascination in exhibiting the horrors of the past. Curators and showmen assembled props, embellished old objects, and built terrifying devices to draw crowds. A spiked iron coffin sells more tickets than an honest plaque explaining that most torture used simple ropes and screws. Part of it is storytelling. Later generations like to imagine themselves as enlightened and modern by contrast with a barbaric, ignorant medieval past. Exaggerating the cruelty of the Dark Ages flattered the present. The wilder the device, the better the story. But here's the truth that actually matters, and it's sobering in its own quiet way. Real torture rarely needed elaborate machines. The genuine instruments, the rack, the strappado, the thumb screw, were often brutally simple. And crucially, torture in medieval and early modern Europe was frequently a legal tool used by courts to extract confessions, operating on the deeply flawed belief that pain produces truth. That's the real horror. Not a fantastical spiked maiden, but ordinary ropes and screws used by official courts on real people who would confess to anything to make the agony stop. The fake devices distract us from a more uncomfortable reality. That organized, legalized cruelty doesn't require monstrous machines. It only requires the willingness to inflict pain. And that's a far more important lesson than any horror movie prop. The final truth. So let's gather everything we've uncovered. The rack that stretched bodies until joints tore apart real. The strappado that dislocated shoulders with nothing more than a rope and a beam real. The thumb screw that crushed fingers a fraction of a turn at a time real. The scold's bridle that caged a woman's tongue in iron to silence and shame her real, and a grim window into how punishment policed society. But the Iron Maiden, that spiked coffin of nightmares, almost certainly a later invention. The Pear of Anguish and the Judas Cradle? Disputed at best, likely myths, dressed in medieval clothing to thrill the curious. The deeper lesson is twofold. First, that we should be careful with the gory stories we inherit, because much of what we know about medieval torture was exaggerated for profit and to make the past look more savage than our present. And second, that the genuine history is disturbing precisely because it's so ordinary simple devices used by real courts, on the false belief that suffering reveals the truth. Every modern protection against torture, every legal principle that a confession extracted by pain is worthless, was built in reaction to this long, dark history. If this journey into the real and the fake gripped you, hit subscribe and ring the bell more. Buried secrets are waiting to be unlocked. Tell us in the comments, Which torture device did you always believe was real? And until next time, never forget, the truth about the past is often stranger than the myth. A brief note before you go, this video explored torture purely as history. It's heavy subject matter, and it's worth remembering as a measure of how far human justice has come